Welcome to another episode of the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research Analysis for the CDA Institute. A new report from Justice Marie-Josée Hogue found no evidence of traitors in Canada's parliament, contradicting claims from a National Security Committee that some MPs and senators were knowingly involved in foreign interference. While foreign meddling remains a threat, Hogue concluded that recent elections were not compromised and that disinformation, both foreign and domestic, poses the greatest danger to Canadian democracy. The report includes 51 recommendations to strengthen the government's response to foreign interference. To discuss the findings of the Foreign Interference Commission's report and its key recommendations, we're joined today by Richard Fadden, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, and Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow at CG. This is the Expert Series. So great to have you on the podcast, Wesley. The public inquiry into foreign election interference was launched in response to media reports and a Parliamentary Intelligence Committee's claim last spring that some MPs were, quote unquote, wittingly assisting foreign states. So just this week in her final report, which was released on Tuesday, Commissioner Marie-Hogue found no evidence of traitors in Parliament, but had some criticisms for the government's response to the threat. So maybe you could start by providing a really brief backgrounder, if possible, for our audience on how we got here, and maybe touch on what you thought were some of the report's most key recommendations or findings.
Josh, I'm absolutely happy to, and thank you for inviting me back to the podcast. Just to reel ourselves back to the beginning. Of course, we began to see leaks of classified intelligence being reported in the media on especially Chinese foreign interference starting in the fall of 2022. So this does go back a number of years. And those leaks intensified and began to focus more on the 2021 election and various allegations early in 2023. I think reluctantly, the government then tried to find some means to deal with these leaks and the attendant media tension and a brewing political controversy in Parliament, where opposition political parties were charging the government with having deliberately turned a blind eye to foreign interference. So this got quite explosive and very, very partisan. And the government tried to do a couple of things. One, it tried to encourage Parliament to accept that it would turn over this question of foreign interference to a couple of review bodies, independent review bodies, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, one, and the other, the Special Committee of Parliamentarians with top secret clearances and access to classified information, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. So that was one sort of pathway in which they tried to deal with this issue. And the other was to appoint, as you'll recall, and your listeners, I think, will recall, to appoint what they called an independent special rapporteur in the form of the Honorable David Johnston, previously a Governor General, one time head of McGill Faculty of Law, very distinguished individual, who nevertheless, conservative opposition leader, kind of denigrated from the very beginning as, what is an independent special rapporteur? Does he have a sort of Superman's costume or something like that? So it was never really taken seriously by the opposition. Mr. Johnston proceeded to try and do his work, assigned to him as independent special rapporteur to look into Chinese foreign interference in particular, produced an initial first report, presented it to the public and Parliament. It was kind of roundly denounced by Parliament, who felt it wasn't enough, didn't like really the tenor of it, and demanded that there be a public inquiry. So the government was kind of stalemated at that point. Not to give you the entire blow-by-blow history of this, but over the summer then of 2023, political parties got together, including the governing party, backroom negotiations to come up with terms of reference for a public inquiry headed by a judge. This was all worked out. Terms of reference were created and provided to Justice Hogue in September 2023. So she began her work then. I think it's important to recognize that the terms of reference really set the framework for what Justice Hogue was meant to focus on, what she could do and what she couldn't do. And it is really not a fair criticism to say, well, she didn't cover this issue or that issue when it wasn't in her terms of reference. The terms of reference, again, baked by political parties in agreement, was very specifically focused on election interference by China and other states. And there were really two parts to her mandate. One was to look back and to come up with a fact-based investigation and set of findings about what Justice Hogue and her legal team had discovered about foreign interference attempts in the 2019 and 2021 federal elections, and to assess the impact of those efforts and intents. And Justice Hogue produced a preliminary or initial report, as she called it, in May 2024, and then the final report came out on Tuesday of this week. And they, to try and sum up very bulky volumes and a lot of work that the commissioner put into this and her legal team. Essentially, in looking back, what she found was that, yes, there had been foreign interference attempts, but essentially they were on a pretty small scale in terms of impact, and they had not really had any influence or impact on the outcome of either the 2019 or 2021 elections. So looking back in this fact-based investigation, I think that the message that comes out of the public inquiry is that Canadians need to be reassured that those federal elections were free and fair, were not tainted in any significant way by foreign interference, that Canada's democratic process is held up in the face of these foreign interference attempts. So that's one part. That's the backward-looking part of the mandate. What really featured in the final report was the forward part or the forward-looking part of the mandate, which required the commissioner to try to come up with a set of recommendations about how a future government could better detect, deter, and counter foreign interference, including in its impact on diaspora communities. So the bulk of the final report deals with that forward-looking piece. Justice Hogue came up with 51 recommendations, some of which she hoped could be implemented, as she said in her report, promptly. I think that's very unlikely. We can come to that question in a minute if you like. But it was interesting that she would try at least to prioritize these and say, these are the most important things to get started on. Here are other, recommendations that are important, but perhaps need longer term implementation and reflection. And those recommendations, touch on a wide number of issues, how to improve the work of the intelligence community, how to improve the RCMP, how to try and ensure that parliamentarians are better informed about threats of foreign interference and can better inform themselves, measures to protect diaspora communities, recommendations about how to deal with what Justice Hogue clearly believes is the most significant threat going forward, which is the threat of disinformation and the ways in which our information environment on which we depend now for political discourse could become polluted. So they were, there's a lot of recommendations. They were very wide-ranging. And, I think to be fair to the commission, one has to say that given the short time frame and the enormous number of documents and witnesses that they had to hear from and try and digest and make sense of, the commission really has done, I think, important work for Canadians. Again, both looking back and perhaps more importantly, looking forward and saying the essence of the forward-looking piece, apart from all the details of the recommendations, the essence is that foreign interference is changing. It is using new technological tools. It is increasingly focused on not traditional means of kind of person-to-person, kind of backroom, covert efforts to interfere and influence, but it's really focusing these days on the digital world and engaging in sophisticated disinformation campaigns, which she is very worried about. So, and she calls those existential threats for the future. So, I think it was a very solid report. one could always criticize, say that, well, there should have been more of this, more of that, but a very substantial report produced for public inquiries at lightning speed, it has to be said.
Well, that's a fantastic primer, Wesley. I think our audience can take a lot away from that. Um, I'd like to hopefully touch on disinformation for just a moment or two. Um, what what really is meant by the term disinformation here, especially within the context of this report? What harm, like what forms does it take? What kind of harms can it pose, and how do we address disinformation, or just rather kind of learn to live with this new information environment? That's a huge question, but I'm curious what ideas you have.
So, Josh, I may be better at defining the terms as opposed to finding some magic solution to the challenge. But I think it is important to begin by defining the terms. So, in the new world of information operations, as it's often called, there are three key terms that are used by intelligence security communities that their publics are going to have to get used to, and they're distinct terms. There's disinformation. There's something called malinformation, which we talk about less, and there's misinformation. So let me just quickly try and sort of cut these up and explain, what is distinctive about each. Disinformation refers to um, deliberate attempts by a foreign state or its proxies conducted in a kind of clandestine and deceptive manner to foster falsehoods and have them circulated in the digital information space. So it is what used to be called in the classic world of information operations, it's black propaganda. It is a deliberate dissemination of lies. Why? For a couple of broad objectives that will not surprise any of your listeners. One, to try and curry favor for a foreign state's position on some domestic or foreign policy issue. The other, to use disinformation campaigns to kind of mess with the minds of diaspora communities and to try and encourage people to think in certain kinds of ways, or even to dissuade them from thinking in certain kinds of ways, or even dissuade them from getting involved in political processes. So it is very insidious. The technological tools that can be used are getting increasingly sophisticated. So we could talk about ways in which artificial intelligence comes into play. We can talk about the ways in which all kinds of bot networks can amplify these messages. We can talk about deep fakes, or what the commissioner referred to as altered content. And deep fakes, as many of your listeners will know, are essentially wholly artificially created images of individuals, wholly artificially created audio of speeches or exchanges, artificially created text. So it is complete fakery, and it can be. In the beginning, early deep fakes were kind of laughable. I mean, there's a famous one of which purported to be some remarks made by President Zelensky, for example, which it was so amateur it was laughable. But it's not something that we can afford to laugh at these days. It's getting ever more sophisticated. So that is disinformation, and I think the key terms underlying it are deliberate, deceptive, covert falsehoods. The distinction between disinformation and misinformation is that misinformation also deals in falsehoods, but not deliberately. Misinformation is simply untruthful content that's circulated without malicious intent on behalf of individuals or organizations that believe or claim to believe it's true. So a very important difference between trying to inject disinformation into a discourse as opposed to what is going to be part of any political discourse in any democratic society, lots of misinformation. And then there's an interesting kind of bridge between them called malinformation, which perhaps your listeners have heard less about. But it's a term of art that's used by the security intelligence agencies. Malinformation is where, again, foreign state comes into play in the background. Foreign state finds some misinformation, that it has itself not generated, but it might be useful to spread. So it's not creating the content, but it's getting involved in the amplification of misinformation. So malinformation kind of exists in the gray area between misinformation and disinformation. Why all this is important, in part, is to understand the dangers and the respective potential countermeasures to deal with them. I think we would all have to accept that a state and state agencies really have no business trying to inject themselves into the world of misinformation. They can decide to come up with their own messaging about some issue or another, but they can't try to remove misinformation or alter it or make it illegal or anything like that. So misinformation is a kind of hands-off proposition for the government. Disinformation is a very different thing altogether. And I think it's understood that disinformation is dangerous. And because it's foreign state sponsored, it falls in that category of things that a country like Canada has a responsibility to try and detect, deter, and counter, to do something about. So really our efforts are focused on disinformation. That doesn't mean it's easy by any means. Disinformation is hard to identify. It's hard to distinguish sometimes from misinformation, and you have to be very careful again because we want to preserve, the right of free speech and people to have whatever views they want to have. Um, what David Vigneault once referred to as lawful but awful speech. I mean, there is lots of that these days, more of it perhaps than we would like. Um, so it's hard. Disinformation, properly understood, is hard to identify. It is hard to attribute. That is, to be sure that it's coming from a foreign state or a proxy. And it's also hard, inevitably, to decide. Okay, well, we've decided that China, Russia, or India is behind this disinformation campaign. What are we going to do about it? Then comes into play the question of, well, how significant was this? Do we really want to spend scarce resources dealing with it, and how do we deal with it, and so on? So it's a very, very complex issue. But at the end of the day, it matters because it is interference in democratic discourse. And we really are, Justice Ho calls this as existential threat. I could, you always have to be careful about using the word as existential threat in a national security sense. If you throw that word around too many times, you start to cry wolf, and people will perhaps take it less seriously. But it clearly is a growing threat, and I think she was right in terms of that forward-looking perspective to really call attention to it.
Thanks for that discussion on the distinctions between mis, dis, and malinformation, Wesley. I think those are important distinctions for our listeners, and you kind of painted what is really a sort of brave new world with social media and the rapid circulation of information. This is something we could continue talking about for a long time, but in the interest of time, I will move on to my final question, and that's,
Sure.
in your opinion, what does the report say about the effectiveness of Canada's current institutions and intelligence agencies in detecting and countering foreign interference? And as we head into a new federal election, at least by close to the end of this year, what do you think are the key takeaways for policymakers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll try and be as short-winded about it as I can. I think what Justice Hogue found was that, and she's critical of the current government for this. She found that in the past, the Liberal government had been slow to react to foreign interference, and had not necessarily taken it as seriously in political circles, and even among senior officials at that level, taken it as seriously as it needed to be taken. So that's one part of what she's found. Looking back, slow on the uptake. She also says, well, over time, and partly spurred by various incidents, including the affair of the two Michaels, that the government was forced to take these matters more seriously, even before they were subject to, any media leaks and all the, political circus and partisanship that surrounded them. So began to take them more seriously. Importantly, constructed some mechanisms to protect elections, starting for the 2019 election that were then ramped up further for 2021. So slow start, improvements, current circumstance. Justice Hogue suggests there have been a lot of recent additions to the capabilities of the national security system to deal with foreign interference. And she talks about, improved dissemination of intelligence, new governance mechanisms, the importance of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor and the National Security Council, and so on. But she also says that many of these changes are so recent, and I should add changes in legislation, particularly Bill C-70. She says, well, many of these changes are so recent that I'm really not in a position to judge their effectiveness. She notes that they've been made, but she can't measure, how effective they will be. So we're going through these evolutionary stages, and perhaps that's not a surprise. But I think the key takeaway from the report is that, while there are future threats that we need to pay attention to, in terms of the question of being able to protect our elections and related democratic processes, I think the finding really is that Canada has some pretty robust mechanisms to do that, and Canadians should have confidence in their ability to hold free and fair elections. What I suggest is the best answer. It's a complex issue. It's really, I think you have to look at it in the kind of evolving context that the commissioner was critical of the fact that the Liberal government was essentially slow on the uptake in terms of taking threats of foreign interference seriously. That events in a way propelled them to take them more seriously, not least the Two Michaels affair, and they began to take them more seriously, well before the media leaks in the fall of 2022. But events were driving this, so it was a bit reactive. So slow in the uptake, beginning improvements, creation, importantly, starting with the 2019 federal election, of some important mechanisms to protect elections from foreign interference and be able to issue warnings if necessary, publicly even, about foreign interference threats to try and kind of avoid the problem the American administration had found themselves in. Efforts that were ramped up for the 2021 federal election. And in terms of sort of an overall sense of, how good are those mechanisms, I think the commissioner is really conveying a message that Canadians should have confidence that they're pretty robust mechanisms, whether it's, defending the integrity of the electoral process itself, which is controlled by the Canada Elections Act, or the surrounding work to identify foreign interference and detect, deter, and counter it. The mechanisms are in place, but it's an evolving story. So you start slowly, you ramp up. She also comments in her report that she has seen a lot of very recent changes to some key deficiencies that have been noted, not least in terms of the dissemination of intelligence and making sure that it could be paid attention to by political decision makers. And she talks about some of those efforts, important changes to legislation, including Bill C-70, which gave new powers to CSIS and created the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry, which has not yet been stood up. So lots of very, very recent changes. And she says about them, essentially, don't quote me on this, kind of paraphrase, they look good, but she's in no position to be able to really judge their efficacy because they're so new. So that's the kind of runway or launch pad. It is, an ascending and ever better effort, it seems. But at the end of the day, she also says, these efforts were designed for a certain kind of foreign interference threat. We're facing new threats going forward in the future. Disinformation, as we talked about, is going to be one of the key threats. So I guess the message is twofold. Be confident looking back. Don't be complacent looking forward. Efforts to counter a changing threat are going to have to be ever more persistent. And one message she has for parliamentarians is, Parliament is part of the game. They have to be better informed about foreign interference, collectively, individually. They also have to better inform themselves about foreign interference and really take it seriously as legislators for the Canadian public and as an important point of public, important forum for public debate. So the past looks okay. The future looks less bright.
Wesley, thanks again for coming on the program. I always appreciate your willingness to come and talk about these issues with our audience. And of course, we appreciate your thought leadership and everything that you do as well to educate policymakers of the public. So really appreciate your time today and hope we can keep doing this. Thank you. Pleasure as always to have you on, Dick, and thanks for joining us to discuss the recent findings on foreign interference. So just this week, Justice Hogue released the final report on foreign interference in Canada's elections. What were some of the main findings, and did this report have any different takeaways compared to previous assessments on foreign interference in Canada?
Three main takeaways. The first one was no election, no federal election, and no by-election was substantively affected by foreign interference. That's good news. And that, I think, confirms what David Johnston concluded in his earlier reports. Secondly, having said this, I think she concluded clearly and unambiguously foreign interference is a problem. It is with us. It's with us now. And she has a number of recommendations about how to deal with it in the future. And thirdly, at a sort of a meta level, I think she concluded that the government has not been as speedy and as enthusiastic in dealing with this as it might have been. So broadly speaking, I don't think what she's saying is significantly different from earlier reports, but I think she goes into a bit more detail and she's somewhat more pointed in looking forward.
Thanks, Dick. Reflecting on some of the recommendations in the report, from your understanding or knowledge of it, what would you say were maybe some of the potentially most effective recommendations? And given that legislative changes would take time, what are maybe some immediate policy actions that the government could take?
Well, on the policy actions, there are a number of recommendations relating to the handling of intelligence, how they're dealt with up and down the system. I think there are a number which, while they may require legislation in the fullness of time, for example, those recommendations dealing with political parties, nothing prevents the government and political parties from saying we're going to do this voluntarily. I think one of our more interesting recommendations is the creation of an entity to deal with open sources in Canada, domestic open sources, that will deal with mis and disinformation that she advocates will be developed with the national security community, but which would enable, I think, the government or that entity, I'm not quite sure how independent it would be, to be able to make the point publicly that we are in receipt of mis and disinformation.
Dick, you spent quite a bit of time in government. How effective would you say the Canadian government has been in detecting and countering foreign interference? And what might you say are some of the primary challenges faced in responding to things like foreign interference?
Well, I think it's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, a lot of people think that the government only sort of has to wave a magic wand, but we have to remember that foreign interference, by definition, is foreign interference that is carried out under the radar screen, secretly. So we have, in particular, three or four governments that are very, very sophisticated and very adept at doing this. So it's not easy to deal with this. You have to find it in the first place. You can be lucky and find it. You can be fortunate in having somebody point it out to you. But other than that, you have to use, by and large, highly intrusive methods of investigation in order to discover it. I would argue, broadly speaking, before I do that, let me say we have to remember that foreign interference is not just mis and disinformations. It's affecting people by threatening them sometimes to do or not do something. It's hauling in people for elections. It's a whole variety of things. So there's a mix there between, on the one hand, the very physical and old-fashioned, giving a lot of money to an ethnic newspaper, to the highly sophisticated mis and disinformation on social media. So, I don't think it's easy, but I equally don't think that the current government, which has been in office for 3 mandates, has had this at the top of their list of priorities. That's not to say that the national security agencies haven't paid attention to this, but when the government isn't telling you this is important, do something about it, it doesn't get the priority that it needs. I also think that CSIS, CSE, and the RCMP are somewhat stretched. This is not the only problem they have to deal with. And it's something that we tend to forget. Once something comes, high on the media screen, we sort of say, oh my God, we've got to do something about that. But I think it's important to remember they have a whole raft of other things they're already busy doing. So if you put all that together, I would say that as a country, we've been slowly improving. Public awareness has improved. There's been more reporting on it. The government appointed Madame Hogue. That's a good sign. But I don't really get the impression that we've given it the priority, say, that the United States or the United Kingdom has given it.
Well, I was just going to ask, in what ways do you think Canada's national security culture compares with that of our allies, say, in the Five Eyes? And from your perspective, is there anything we can learn from our allies when it comes to addressing these sort of specific foreign interference threats?
Well, speaking broadly, I don't think Canada has a national security culture, period. Um, I would argue, as have a number of others, the reason we don't really have one is the Canadians, broadly speaking, don't feel threatened. And if you don't feel threatened, uh, politicians are quite adept at figuring out where votes are. There are no votes in national security. So politicians don't give it the priority that I think it deserves. If you think back the last two or three federal elections, I don't think national security, foreign interference, foreign affairs, or defense was mentioned more than in passing. So if you put all that together, it means we don't have a culture throughout the system to deal with things like foreign interference. In the United States, they have, a national security culture that's obvious, so I'm not going to comment on it. But I also think in other countries like the United Kingdom or Australia or France, they have one. The United Kingdom and France, they've been at this for a long time, fairly substantial states. And in the case of Australia, they're much closer to China. It tends to focus the mind.
You spoke about Canada's sort of lack of a national security culture just now. Um, from your perspective over this past decade of a lot of changes in the international security environment, do you think that our perception of national security threats has heightened at all, or do you see it as saying the same as it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago?
That's a very good question. I don't think it's changed a great deal. I think, Machiavelli and Sun Tzu argued that one of the most effective requirements for a state to be successful is self awareness. I think in national security, defense, and foreign affairs, we're not particularly self aware. Every government comes in, with a broad area of focus. Mr. Trudeau's government, 3 terms, was, I think, social policy. National defense and security was at the bottom of their list, except when an emergency or something particular forced them to deal with it. So you put all this together again, and I think we're left with a situation that is slowly changing. If you look at recent polling, Canadians are much more aware of China as a threat, strategic threat now than they were 5 or 6 or 7, 8 years ago. But overall, I don't think people in Canada worry as much about national security, broadly defined, as most of our allies.
Given that we do have an election, probably at the very latest, closer to the end of this year coming up, um, what kinds of takeaways do you think there are in this most recent report for policymakers or people in intelligence agencies ahead of this upcoming election?
Well, in terms of upcoming election, it'll be interesting to see if it becomes a topic what at all. I think right now the country is consumed by what United States President Trump is going to do with tariffs and with a whole bunch of other things, because a number of his activities or proposed activities will, I think, destabilize the international environment. I think if there's going to be an interest in foreign defense and security policy, it'll probably be, sort of certain, around President Trump and what he's up to. I don't think that's going to go away between now and the federal election. Having said that, if you look at the Hug report in the broad context that I've just talked about, they are not ring. She is not ringing alarm bells that the nation's continued existence is at risk. So I think to a considerable degree, while there may be some discussion of what's in there, I don't think it's going to be the sort of thing that's going to fill up, for example, either the leadership debate of the Liberal Party or the eventual election campaign. It would be nice if we talked about these things, because I do think Mr. Trump's destabilization of the international system is going to mean we're going to have to focus on these things more than we have in the past. I'm hopeful. I can't say I'm absolutely certain it's going to happen.
I'm hoping we can chat about INSICOP just for a moment or two before we conclude the interview, Dick. What impact has INSICOP had, and has it had any kind of measurable effect on government policy related to national security?
I think it has had an impact. I mean, just the principle of its creation, I think, was a recognition on the part of the government that Parliament has to have some role in dealing with national security issues, because before then it was virtually impossible to clear any parliamentarian for any purpose. So just that recognition, I think, brings us slowly into the 21st century and aligns us more carefully with our allies that do provide for a role for their national legislatures. It has produced a significant number of reports. I think they've gotten a reasonable amount of media attention, not as much attention in Parliament as you would have liked. But as one of NSI Cop's own reports said, the bad news is the government has been not very good at all in implementing its recommendations. So you can have the greatest royal commission or, independent study in the world with fantastic, useful recommendations. If they are not implemented, is it a total waste of time? No, because it raises awareness. But you need to implement these things, much like, as you were saying a moment ago, the 4 or 5 or 6 recommendations that Madame Hogue puts forward for legislative change. Whoever forms the next government, I think, should amend the Canada Elections Act, which is one of her major recommendations, because I think the recommendations make a lot of sense. There seems to be a consensus that they are a good deal, but it's going to require the expenditure of political capital and time, and we can only hope they'll do that.
Dick, I'm just hoping to touch on that point a little bit more here for our audience that maybe hasn't read the report. What specific recommendations were there in terms of amending the Elections Act, and how might that have a positive impact?
I think, speaking in generalities, not going into subsection 97, she basically says that if we are going to deal effectively with foreign interference, it cannot just affecting our democratic processes. It cannot only be with political parties once the writ is dropped. It has to take into account the activities of political parties and how they choose their candidates. This is a substantial change in Canada because there's always been a reluctance on the part of government, all governments, to involve themselves in the activities of political parties because they don't want to be seen to interfering. So what she's basically saying is we need to change the rules so that these political parties, the simplest example is you can't become a candidate unless you're a Canadian citizen or a landed immigrant, something that the Liberal Party has just decided to do in the context for their leadership. But there are a bunch of others regarding, the expenditures of the monies and reporting and whatnot, all of which I think will considerably lessen, once they're done and put into place, concerns about whom we select to be our representatives in political parties and whom we eventually send to Parliament. But again, this is just riveting. It has to be implemented. The chief electoral officer, who's the one who's going to be primarily responsible for managing them, these has to be given, the resources to implement them and to make sure that the policy is being carried out.
Now, Dick, you were director of CSIS and former national security and intelligence advisor to the Prime Minister. Finally, what kind of key recommendations might you give to improve Canada's national security posture, whether that comes to intelligence, policymaking, or just public awareness?
I think um, we're not going to have an effective national security culture or environment unless we accept that there's a need for it. And I think that collectively, and your efforts here are part of this, we need to talk about it more. We live in the federal government. It's very hierarchical. The prime minister's at the top of the mountain. What we need is a prime minister, I think, who is interested in national security and makes it clear to his ministers and officials that we want things to be treated seriously. At the other end of the equation, I think that CSIS, CSC, the Mounties, the Privy Council office, they have to show a fair bit of courage when necessary to make sure that when they have intelligence that affects national security, that they boot it upstairs effectively. And I think more than anything, we need politicians who show some leadership and understanding of these issues, both within and outside of Parliament.
Well, Dick, good to see you again, and thanks for making some time to come on the podcast and share your expertise and insights with us. We really appreciate it over here at the CDA, and I hope we can continue to do this in the future.
Glad to do it, and always happy to talk.
And that brings us to an end of today's episode. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cedainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks for listening, and we hope you join us next time.